Before we get going today, if you could just do me a quick favor, just hit that subscribe button. It will really help me out and help us out. And it'll let us know that you're enjoying this content and you want us to keep making more. So by subscribing, you're going to help us do that. Now, this week's podcast topic is, can we help your horses live longer? And it is a fun topic to discuss because we're going to look at the data. Are horses living longer? And then what steps can you do or you take to help your horses live longer and compete longer and just live their best lives possible? And at the end of this podcast, we're going to look at some tips on how you can help your geriatric horses. Now, to start all this off, how old do horses get? Now, in the wild, because that is our best comparison to our domestic horses, it's estimated that wild horses live anywhere from 15 to 20 years old, which is pretty standard for herbivore. The wild is a very tough place to live. Not only is it food restricted sometimes, water restrictions, being chased by predators, any sort of illness, you don't have a veterinarian around to help you. So it makes sense that wild horses don't live quite as long as our domestic horses. So how old do horses get? Well, we did the wild. Okay, the wild's good. Now, there's many different factors on domestic horses, and I'm going to kind of go through some of that, but things like breed, some people saying fjord horses live into their 30s, minis living into their 30s, some of our draft breeds living into their late teens, early 20s, thoroughbreds, average age you see is 25. So we'll talk about that. But before we jump into that, let me give you some comparisons on ages of horses and say ages of humans, because I think when we put it in our terms, sometimes it's easier for us to digest and go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I covered this in one of the earliest podcasts that I did, but when we compare it, if we look at, say, a horse as a yearling to a human, that's about 6.5, 7 years old. So, early on, horses grow really, really quickly. That slows down. Now, by the time a horse is 5 and physically mature, that's in human years around 24 to 25 years old. So those first 5 years, they go through their adolescence, much like we do. And by the time they're 5, they're fully mature. Now, let's say when their horse is 10, that's about a 35-year-old human. By the time they're 17, a horse is 17, they're getting close to my age in their 50s, 53. When they hit 20, that is typically age-wise, we say they're a senior horse. Now, that's going to vary by breed, by size, by individual horse. But in general, when they hit 20, we say, okay, you're a senior, and that's about equal to 60 years old. Now, if we jump to 30, that's extremely old. That is about 85 and a half in human years. And then if we jump to 36, they're saying that's about a 100-year-old human. Okay. So that gives you some idea when we talk about horses living into their 20s. So that's us past 60. Into their 30s, some horses into their 40s. And then I'm going to tell you a story today of the world record holder, how old that horse lived. Now, the other important aspect of this podcast is also, are horses living longer today than yesteryear or even 20 years ago? Because we have gotten so advanced in our care as far as veterinary care. So treating diseases, modern vaccines, parasites, controlling worms, and just overall care. Horses are surviving things that in yesteryear they might not survive. But the other aspect of this is diet and nutrition. I've talked a lot about it in previous podcasts where today horses are fed diets specifically tailored to them, where 100 years ago, they were feeding straight grains and some hay. Today, we have diets for all different classes of horses and even into our senior horses. And we're getting so advanced that we know specific nutrients, specific vitamins and minerals horses are deficient in, and we have mixes and stuff to do that. We'll talk a little bit about, arthritis. There's nutrients that can help limit that. There is all sorts of different specialty diets and supplements that we feed horses today that are helping them live longer. And is that supported by the data? So yes, let's jump into it. Are horses living longer today in the 2020s than say 2000 or the 90s or the 80s? And some of the best data we have comes out of the United States. So this is coming out from the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. When they surveyed horses across the United States looking at ages, yes, horses are living longer. So there's the bottom line. But when we look at data they collected in 1998, 2005, and 2015, in 1998, the percent of horses that they surveyed the owners, over 10,000 owners, the amount of horses that were over the age of 20 was 5.6%. In 2005, that went up to 7.6%. And then in 2015, so just a few years ago, that's 11.5% or close to it. So from 5% to over 11%, that doubled the amount of horses that are past the age of 20. And that's just in the last 26, 27 years. Now, when they go, why, just to quote them, it says, the increasing percentage of equids more than 20 years of age across study years could potentially be explained by advancements in healthcare across the equid's life. Some advancements include development of nutritional products specifically designed to meet the special needs of older horses. Then it talks about advancements in treating disease. And we're going to talk about Cushing's a little bit, which is now known as PPID, lameness, improving in that, laminitis, treatment of laminitis, and just our overall understanding of equid care. So that's a study showing, yes, horses are living longer. And I've got a few others that we're going to bring up today. But when we look at the factors on how old horses can live, some of the data shows that the average overall now today is horses are living in 25 to 30, okay, on average. So again, wild horses, 15, if they're lucky, 20, wow. Out to 30 is really rare. And I know I talked about that a few weeks ago, talking about Picasso, a stallion in Colorado. He lived into his 30s. That was very rare. But they do, it does happen. I'll talk about the world record holder here in a minute, who's the oldest one. Race horses or horses off the track, they live into their 20s, up to 25 years old. Arabian horses tend to live longer. They have stronger immune systems. So they can live, on average about 30 years. Mini horses are little ones, so they can live up to 35 years. Draft horses, low 20s, late teens. They talked about middle-aged horses. So if we look at historically, middle age, so we're talking 1600s. So that's over 400 years ago. Those horses lived to only be about 15. And then it said in colonial America, horses only lived about 7 years. And then in the 1800s, horses were living about a decade. So we see horses living longer and longer in the 20th century, and then in the 21st century, we're pushing them a few more years past their normal dates. And then just to back up some of those averages, there was a study in Preventative Veterinary Medicine published just a couple years ago, factors associated with mortality of geriatric horses in the United Kingdom. And the median age at death was 24.4 years. And that was over 1,000 horses that they looked at. Now, the next story I want to talk about, because that is going to lead into how you can help your horses live longer. And this story is about old Billy the barge horse. Now, I've spoken about him in a previous podcast. He is the world record holder of being the world's oldest known horse. And he lived to be 62 years old, which is phenomenal. Now, Old Billy was born in 1760 in northern England, and he died in 1822. Now, some of you are probably skeptical, like, okay, maybe it was just they got the horses mixed up, but he wasn't. He was owned and managed by the same person over those 60 years. He was bought by Henry Harrison when he was 17, and he estimated Billy was a 2-year-old. And he owned Billy throughout his life. Now, Billy worked for a navigation company, and so did Henry Harrison, and he cared for Billy throughout his life. And there's portraits of them together later in life when people would go and paint Billy's portrait. He was famous. He was famous in England because he was so old. And Billy was, so they said they called him a barge horse, meaning they would pull barges down the canals in England, and merry old England. If you've never been there, it's beautiful. And there's canals everywhere. And they would be shipping, goods from Manchester to Liverpool, from the coal mines down the canals to where it had to go. Remember, this is Industrial Revolution, 1700s, early 1800s. And so they would have horses pull barges. And they think Billy might have done that, but he also was a gin horse. Now, not gin the drink, but engine, right? So he was actually hooked up to a rotary wheel, and he would pull, and it would help lower or raise cargo on these canals. The whole point is Billy was a working horse throughout his life. He was constantly strengthening his muscles, moving about, probably fed the appropriate diet for the day, and he wasn't sedentary. And then in 1822, when they saw him right before he died, the veterinary surgeon, who was a Mr. W. Johnson, saw Billy, and he wrote that the horse, quote, had the use of all his limbs in tolerable perfection, lies down and rises with ease, and when in the meadows will frequently play and even gallop with some young colts which graze along with them. This extraordinary animal is healthy and manifests no symptoms whatsoever of approaching dissolution. End of quote. So even at 62, Billy was a horse. He was acting like a horse. He wasn't some decrepit old animal. He was running around, and he seemed fine. Now, his obituary was published in January of 1823. And if I can read this, it's just historical and it's fun. And we owe a lot to old Billy and all the other horses, right? So in his obituary, it said, Wednesday night, this faithful servant died at an age which has seldom been recorded of a horse. He was in his 62nd year. And they think he died just a few weeks before that, at the end of 1822. So old Billy's skull is in the Manchester Museum. The teeth show him to be very, very old. And they think maybe, he was eating soft mashes at his old age. And that's what they noted, what they were feeding him, because he couldn't really chew much forage. And he was very well taken care of, but he lived 62. That's incredible. We don't have any horses in the world that we know of living into their 60s right now. So you just had this one horse that was just very special, and they're able to say, yeah, you lived a very fruitful and long life. But I think we can take away some things about how Billy lived that long and then apply that to all of our other equids and other things that we're going to talk about today. But it started with, they didn't retire Billy out to pasture. And that concept's outdated. You even talk to veterinarians, they will tell you, you don't want to just put your old horses out there without any sort of exercise or strengthening or things that you can do with them. you don't want to push them to exhaustion, right? You don't want to push them to where they're in pain, but they need some sort of movement and exercise. If we apply that to humans, we see that with, our older population. We want them moving and exercising and, getting their joints in motion, because when we become sedentary, that is where the body starts to shut down and you lose that strength. So when you think of an old horse, like old Billy, he needed that strength to get up off the ground when he laid down or when he wanted to roll around. And sure, he was probably arthritic. Sure, he probably wasn't like the colts as quick or sprightly, but he was still getting up and down okay. And he was still living his life. So that is very, very important. But I will say pasture turnout is critical for any horse, especially our older horses. And the veterinarians will tell you that. But the idea of just retiring them to pasture and that's it, and you're done with them, and you do some medical checks every now and then, your horse probably isn't going to live as long, right? They need some sort of exercise. They need some sort of activity on top of all these other things we're going to talk about today. And if you do that, they can live longer. Now, in another podcast, I talked about athletic horses and we looked at ages of competition. And one of the studies I found looking at in performance horses, show jumping and dressage, and we see horses in their late teens still competing and winning. So where, the average age is 10, 11, 12, where they're really at peak performance, you still get some of these horses that in their late teens, and some of you watching this or listening to this saying, yeah, my horse and I still compete late teens. And before they get to that geriatric age, some horses can. Like I said, 20 is when we consider them to be geriatric, but some horses, they won't hit that till their mid-20s. And some horses in their late teens, they start to degrade performance-wise. But the idea is, these horses can be competitive. These horses can be ridden. They can still be worked. Old Billy didn't retire at 20. He was working up into his late 50s. And then from reading that, then in his 60s, they stopped working him so hard or using him or, having him do what he could do. But he was still productive for those 40 plus years. Like, that's incredible for a horse. It's incredible. Okay. So we know horses can live long. Maybe not as long as old Billy, but again, 20s, getting to their 30s now. And before we can talk about how we can help horses live longer, I think it's good to understand what geriatric or older horses, what are some of the challenges that they're faced with? What are some of the diseases that pop up or the problems that they suffer from, so you can look out for it? And then how do we prevent that? That's going to be the gist of a lot of this, is how do we prevent this from impacting our horses down the road? In a very good study, the Journal of Equine Veterinary Science, again, this was pretty recent, and the research was aging equines, understanding the experience of caring for a geriatric horse with a chronic condition. So this was a very good study looking at what our aged horses go through. And I think they deserve their own podcast at some point where we'll just talk about caring for aged horses, especially nutrition-wise, because that's a challenge. But when we look at some of the things that veterinarians are running across, and this is hundreds of horses that they looked at, the 996 aged horses. Now, before we look at conditions, just note that this was a study of horses over the age of 20 with the average age of 25. Okay, so up there, the geriatric horses. By far the most reported condition was osteoarthritis, which is not too surprising, but 41% of horse owners reported that their aged horses were experiencing that. The next one, and again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, is PPID, which is what we used to call Cushing's disease. It predominantly affects aged horses. 26, almost 27% of horse owners reported their horses suffering from that condition. The second or third one, sorry, was dental disease or conditions. So 15%. So not too bad, but again, we're going to talk about teeth here in a second. Some of the eye problems affected 11% of the horses. So starting to get some blindness and cloudy eyes. Laminitis around 9.8 or 10%, which is typical. 1 out of 10 horses is going to experience laminitis every year. Skin cancer, 9%. Heaves or equine, what we call equine asthma, just under 8%. Then things like diarrhea, heart abnormalities, Lyme disease, 3%, other cancers, 3%, anemia, 1.5%. So, and then you get into some lameness. So this other category, you had some lameness around 2.5%, 3%, tendon problems, 2%, a navicular, 2%. So you can see all those conditions that a lot of you have been around horses for long enough, you're going to run into, but you know, those are the conditions that our aged horse population is experiencing. And then in another study out of the UK, that one earlier, I talked about the average age of 25, similar things, neoplasma, PPID, equine metabolic syndrome. That was upwards that they reported of horses being euthanized for. So, but across the board, you're seeing these horses running into joint issues, Cushing's disease, and some underlying lameness, things like that. And as we get older, even me in my older years, you know, it's you get some aches and pains. And you know, how do we help the horses get through that? Or how do we get the horses? Here's really the best way to look at it this way is we can look at old Billy and we can look at these horses that are living longer and say, why? You know, what is it? What is the common occurrence? Now you get the occasional horse. Like I said, old Billy was, wow, one in millions and millions and millions of horses that have lived on this planet. But if we look at, okay, if we look at the averages, what is helping horses live longer? You know, one of the things always goes back to is diet and exercise, and diet is critical. It's critical to a horse's health and well-being. And I think that's a good place to start. We talked about exercise, and I don't need to say much more about that. I would just say, talk to your veterinarian, especially with your older horses. And you want some exercise, maybe get them in a round pen, maybe go for easy trail ride. I will tell you, as a horse gets older, their backs change. So make sure your tack and equipment is appropriate for them. But, you know, you want to make sure they are exercising, they are getting freedom of movement, and they are muscle building. You know, as we get older, we don't build muscle as much as we did when we were in our teens or 20s, but we can still build muscle in our later years, and we can help horses do that with diet. And that's why there's been so much research in equine nutrition in the last 40, 50 years. Just in the last 20 years of my career, the nutrition data has changed so much. Our understanding of horse diets and specialty feeds and all of this, it's incredible. It's incredible. So diet is a big factor in helping these horses live longer lives. And I'm going to talk about a little bit where diet fits in. But let's just talk about exercise. When horses exercise, obviously you need support for muscle building. You need support for, recovery, because I'm going to talk about stress. Exercise is a good stress, but we need the body to recover. And so you need the nutrients to do that. Horses get much of that from their forage, but there are gaps in the diet. A horse needs more than just forage. And just to give you an example, because I'm going to talk about this, selenium, it's the easiest one as an example because there's many soils around the world that are deficient in selenium. Many of you know, oh, I see selenium in my supplements I feed because of that deficiency we see. Selenium is a critical antioxidant, and oxidative stress is what causes some of these conditions that we see. So if we have a diet that's deficient in, say, selenium and vitamin E and some of these other critical antioxidants, you may not be helping your horse, live longer. But if we feed them correctly and we make sure they have enough antioxidants in their diet, and we make sure that they have the proper amino acids to build muscle, that they have all the other micronutrients that they need, when we fill those gaps with additional feed, then the horse is getting everything in their diet, right? So diet is critical. It's super important. Yet the other aspect of this, and this is where I think horse owners just go, we overfeed them. Okay. So I'm talking about, trace elements, some of our vitamins and minerals that are deficient, but then we are overfeeding horses to where they're, getting obese or they're carrying too much weight. And I highly recommend, if you are concerned about that, go listen to the Obesity podcast. We talk a lot about it. The data shows that over half the horses in the United States are too heavy. They're in a body condition score of over 6. And this is just off some data produced by the AEP, American Association of Equine Practitioners. We talk a lot about feeding too much energy in the diet. So the horses put on too much weight, and they're carrying that, which stresses their joints. Stresses can lead to laminitis, can heart disease, and too much strain on their hearts. And that will lead to a shorter lifespan. It absolutely will. And I guarantee you, old Billy was not obese. Old Billy was probably in a 4 to 5 body condition score out of a 1 to 9 scale. So when it comes to diet, we've got to be cautious that we are meeting their nutritional needs without overfeeding them things like energy, and that can go in the form of, carbohydrates, sugar, starches, too much fat in the diet. All of that can lead to overconditioning your horse. And then it can lead to some of these other problems like equine metabolic syndrome. And when you look at that study out of the UK, that there was a high incidence of older horses in the UK experiencing this. And that's a whole nother podcast. But briefly, I always taught it like it's like type 2 diabetes in humans, where when we eat sugary, starchy meals, insulin spikes. And that's important to put the sugaries, that starches that goes into glucose and store it, right? That's what insulin does. It helps store it. This is a very brief overview. Well, in equine metabolic syndrome, in one of the types, they can't do that. They run into problems, too much insulin in the blood, and then they run into other issues, and so that's going to shorten their lifespans. So again, obesity is a big problem. Horses need to be in a body condition score of 5. 4.5 to 5 is that range out of a 1, and that's using the 9-point Henneke body condition scoring scale. You can do that with high quality forage, with, again, there's so much that goes into that, but like just a good vitamin mineral mix. Most horses will do well on that. Then you get the horses that are competition horses or senior horses that don't digest as well, don't chew as well. They may need they might need additional energy. They might need additional amino acids or specific nutrients. But again, diet is one of the leading ideas on why horses are living longer, because we are feeding them better and smarter. Now, just a quick plug. If you're very confused, talk to an equine nutritionist. Go to Mad Barn, top right, analyze diet, throw your details in there. We'll give you a free diet analysis on what you're feeding your horse and what they need every day. But your knowledge is power. That's totally free. That's, no hitch. There's you don't buy anything or anything. It's completely free for you. So if you haven't done it, I highly recommend it, because looking at these diets and seeing that we're tending to overfeed energy, we're tending to overfeed protein, and we're missing out on key nutrients like selenium, like some of these other zinc, copper, critical nutrients for immune system function. And horses just don't know, because you, me, all of us, we want to do what's best for our horses. And until you have the knowledge, and that's what you're getting by watching this podcast. So diet and exercise are two very, very key points on helping your horses live longer. Another aspect, dental, teeth. Horses range 36 to 44 teeth. So all horses have 12 premolars, then 12 molars, both sides, up and down in the mouth, 12 incisors, so that's their front teeth. And then you're going to get a range of wolf teeth and canine teeth. And so that's why you see a range in 36 to 44. It's genetically driven on how many. Now, with us, our teeth merge with our enamel and we stop growing, and then we have them for the rest of our lives. Horses, that continues to grow and erupt until they're about 20. And then at that point, their teeth stop kind of growing. So when you had old Billy, and they talked about his teeth were horrid for a horse, but he was 62. My goodness, that's why he was eating mashes. And again, they were really helping him. But you want your horse's mouth looked in at least once a year by your equine veterinarian, and your geriatric horses maybe twice a year, because sometimes they lose teeth or they'll crack a tooth. Or typically what happens with most horses is there's chewing forage will grind their teeth down, and sometimes they get sharp points or uneven wear, and that's going to influence how they can chew up their food. Now, the whole idea is you take this long thing of grass. Let's just use one stalk of grass as an example. Horse chews it, breaks it up, reduces particle size, swallows it with saliva, and then all the digestive enzymes and bugs and everything else in the gut can get at those nutrients. Well, when a horse can't chew very well, you'll see it fall out of their mouth, or they don't reduce that particle size enough, and they're not getting optimum digestion. And again, it starts in the mouth. So sometimes they get these sharp points. They'll cut their tongues, they'll cut their cheeks, and it's very painful. So you want to make sure you have your horse's teeth looked at. So for your older horses, you want the vet to be every horse, bottom line, once a year. Those geriatric horses, your vet will look in there if everything looks good, but maybe every 6 months. It's worth that little bit of preventative medicine for your horse to help their longevity. So that means your horse needs to be seeing the vet at least once a year, especially once they hit that late teens, 20 mark. They need to be getting their vaccines. We just did a podcast on this. If you don't vaccinate your horse, chances are they'll get a disease and die. Examples I use, West Nile virus. Not vaccinated against it, mosquito's going to fly on that horse, carrying that virus, bite them, and die. Horses are dying from it every year in the Americas. But wherever you are in the world, you want to make sure your horses are protected against these diseases. And as we age, our immune systems are not as optimal as, say, younger years. So once horses hit those 20s, their immune systems aren't as strong to fight off disease and bugs, parasites. That's the next point. You want to make sure you have a good deworming program. Again, step right next to your veterinarian and just follow their guidance. They know what bugs are in your area of the world. They know what worms are in the soils, and they will lead you down that path on doing fecal floats, identifying the bugs, and treating your horses. But that's critical to any horse, but especially your older horses. So again, going back to diet's critical because you need to support their immune system. So you want to make sure they get all those nutrients. But then some of this preventative medicine, dental care, vaccines, and parasite control, all critical for your older horses. Okay, so let's talk about Cushing's disease. What is it? It used to be known as Cushing's. Now the appropriate one is PPID. So it's pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction. This affects upwards of 20 to 25% of horses over the age of 15. I've seen Cushing's horses, those curly coats, poor muscling, just other signs, abnormal hair coats. So if you haven't seen this before, you can just Google a Cushing's or a curly coated horse. I'll flash up a picture of one here, and you can see how that kind of goes. Oh, now I know some horses in the world during the winter, they develop these curly, really thick coats, especially in those more northern or really southern latitudes. But during the summer, you should never see that. They should shed it, right, as it gets warmer. And with our Cushing's horses, our PPID horses, they keep that curly coat. Muscle atrophy, they lose their top line, poor performance, they're not doing well, the fat deposits at weird spots around the body, weight loss, definitely affects infertility or fertility, abnormal sweating, increased thirst, urination, and their immune system have problems. A very good article on madbarn.com, Learn tab, 13 signs of PPID in horses, long hair coat, muscle loss, and more. Reviewed by Dr. Eleanor Kellen, very famous veterinarian that's on our team. She has input in there too. So a very, very good article to go and look into this disease. I think you need to recognize the symptoms and work with your veterinarian on treatment. There has been a lot of research in the last, I would say, couple decades. There's a very good paper, PPID in horses, that was published out of Australia, but just a couple years ago. And it just talks about it's the most common endocrine disorder of geriatric horses. Again, 25% of horses over the age of 15 may experience this. When we say endocrine, that's hormonal imbalance. The paper kind of goes into the physiology of it, or the pathophysiology of it. I would say the bottom line, we don't know really what causes it. We do know stress in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's something I studied. My PhD was pretty much all looking at stress in horses and impacts on reproduction. But in essence, you have a stress, a stimulus in the brain. Hypothalamus feeds down to the pituitary gland. This is where we get dysfunction, but then it feeds down to the adrenal glands and it releases adrenaline. There is a alpha protein that is abnormal. It's similar to Parkinson's disease in humans. And there is some stress and oxidative stress. So again, this is what I pulled out of this paper. It talks about this accumulation of this alpha-synuclein. This is that protein, and oxidative stress can lead to cytotoxicity and degradation of the neurons, right? That's in the brain. So when, again, we talk about diet, antioxidants, that can help maybe. We don't have the research on it right now, but it's being looked at, diets high in antioxidants, say, versus diets low, and helping hopefully stem the tide of this that we're seeing. So the good news is with that, even though it affects nearly 1 out of 4 horses over the age of 15, we do have tests to identify it. There is some supportive care. It depends on where you are in the world, but we know more about it today than we ever have before. So as this podcast ages, as we move forward in the 2020s into the, say, 2030s, There could be better treatments out there as we identify this disease and the causes, and then preventative. But again, dietary, exercise is good. Exercise gets the blood flowing, gets nutrients to parts around the body. Then we're looking at stress. There are good stresses, and then there's bad. Like I said, I studied a lot of this in my PhD and my further on studies. This is where I made my mark in the equine research world, was looking at the impacts on reproduction, and stress is bad. Some stress is good, like exercise, but it is bad. And so putting this podcast together, we know stress isn't great. So how do we help horses live their best lives if we want them to live longer? And the data shows if you take care of them dietary, and their teeth are checked, they're getting good vet care, that can extend for most horses 4 years to their life, which is incredible. But then there's welfare. And that's been a recent, there's a method to my madness. I'm mad about horses. There's a method to my madness. We just talked about welfare and the 5 domains. And here I'm going to get really nerdy about stress and how the 5 domains can help stress. One of the things we know stress does is it causes cell turnover. And I used to give this talk, and this talk, I get so nerdy, and just bear with me because I get really excited about it, because I really think it's the future of medicine, longevity. There are a lot of geneticists talking about this. And when we look at humans living well into their hundreds and beyond, we go to the DNA of our cells. Every cell has DNA in it, or most cells have DNA in it. And at the ends of each DNA strand are what's called telomeres. And every time the DNA replicates, your telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter. And that leads to aging in the body. And this is a different discussion for another day, but what it does is your body isn't as efficient, especially as those telomeres getting shorter and shorter. And there's much more research going into this to explain this better. But stress can accelerate cell turnover, right? So your telomeres are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and it brings on aging sooner. So that's why stress, this is just one aspect of stress that isn't good, that we can tie it directly to biology. So there's this great paper, and again, I'm going to save this discussion for another day, but telomere regulation, lessons learned from mice and men, potential opportunities in horses. And the author is talking about how horses are a great model to study this because they do live long, right? We know well into their 20s, some into their 30s. And telomere shortening is linked to a lot of human diseases. And if we can find medicines or treatments to slow down telomere shortening or re-lengthen them or whatever, some people think that's the link to longevity. And the longevity medicines and genes in horses are a great model to study that. The point of me bringing that up is we need to reduce stress in our horses' lives. We need to ensure they are living the best life possible. And that's why the 5 domains and horse welfare is so important. And, you really think about, how can I reduce stress in my horse's life? If you really want them to live longer, what are things I can do? Like I said, talked about diet. We talked about exercise. What about their environment, where they live? We know turnout. We don't want to retire horses to pasture where they never come out of it and don't do anything else, but we need turnout time. Half the day, hopefully, could be turnout, where they're out there grazing and getting in the sun and running around, being a horse. But also, if they're stalled, introduce things like hay nets, feeding balls, enrichment that you can do to make their lives better. Not just a little treat that lasts less than a minute, but something that will extend the day for them, that will keep their brains going, that will keep them going. And we talked a lot about that in that podcast, so I don't need to go over all of that. The next one was health. Again, talked about getting their checks, getting their vaccines, getting their deworming program on board with your veterinarian, getting them monitored for things like PPID and testing for that. And again, preventative medicine. That's important. Dental checks, farrier visits. We need their hooves healthy and strong, right? So we want to make sure that they're properly being maintained. And then just letting a horse be a horse. They're social. Let them interact with their conspecifics and look at other horses. I know stall design is changing. This recent conference I was just at, they're changing stalls so horses can have contact with each other, or at least see and hear and smell their other horses in the barn. All of that's to reduce stress. And we want these horses to have their best lives. Now, the final aspect of this is how to help our geriatric horses. And the University of Minnesota Extension, this is Dr. Julie Wilson and Lauren Bullock. Very good, easy to read article, Caring for Your Senior Horse. They talked about physical exams being important, dental checks, saddle fits properly for senior horses, because again, that top line's changing with them. Feeding them their best diet possible, monitor for cancer, monitor for PPID or Cushing's, getting that supportive care. There are things to help horses that are suffering from arthritis, not just nutritionally, but also dietary. But to go through this, again, make sure the horses are maintaining their correct body condition, plan out your vaccines, maybe do some blood tests or urine tests to look for some of these diseases. Early signs for cancer, they said the best places to check are the eyes, muzzle, vulva, or penis of the stallion. Check white areas on the skin, because that's where you see red or raised spots. That's where, like gray horses too, especially develop lumps or melanomas under the skin. So monitor those. But again, just work with your veterinarian, have a cancer check. Check your saddle, talked about that. Feeding and dental care, talked a lot about that. Vaccinations and deworming, talked about that. But again, the reminder, as that horse ages, their immune system ages too. So they're not able to fight off disease as well. So that's why it's very important for vaccinations, deworming, parasite control around your facilities, and then also diet. And then soundness and arthritis, that's really a big one. That's going to be a whole nother discussion. We're going to have to do a podcast on that. But looking at supplements like glucosamine with chondroitin sulfate or MSM, some people are finding that's helpful with horses. There are certain medications, depends where you live in the world, that will help. But if you're really concerned with arthritis, again, madabarn.com, learn tab. There's a very good article on arthritis in horses, symptoms, diagnosis, treatment, and management, or another article that's just been updated, how to manage arthritis in horses, diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. Because that's a big one as we get older. And just my own, I'm an N of 1. So this is just anecdotal. This isn't a study, but in my own life, by introducing things like I drink collagen every day, I am taking multivitamins, I am looking after my health, going to the gym, trying to exercise, stay healthy. And I've noticed, especially when I altered my diet and started adding some supplements, like my knees don't ache, my lower back. I played American football, so had some injuries there. A lot of that pain's gone away. And this isn't just the last few months. This has been the last few years of my life. And I've noticed diet, exercise, reducing stress in my own life, meditation, going for walks in nature. All of that has led to less achy joints, less sleeping well, all of that. And so if I apply that to my animals, and again, thinking of an older horse that I want to eke out at least another 4 or 5 years of their life, that would be so awesome. so incredible, yeah, apply that to them. Feed them properly. Give them some supplements to make sure I'm hitting all those nutrients that they need to support their bodily function. Reduce the stress in their life. Get them out exercising, get them being a horse. All those domains are tied into their optimal well-being. And and just love them. Love them. Love them, and they're going to take care of you. So thank you for listening. Again, just if you could subscribe, that would mean the world to me. It just means we're going to keep producing this content and looking at new avenues of content coming your way. Again, madbarn.com. You can check us out on social media there too, but a whole host of articles and then free nutrition consulting. It's free, completely free. Go to the top of that webpage and click on it. That's a good place to start for your older horses or helping your younger horses live their best life and give them that longevity that you're looking for. So thanks for listening and take care.